Welcome all in, everyone, for another edition of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Some really good action over the course of the weekend. Obviously, like we had Santa Clara, Oregon State. We had Gonzaga rebound from their back-to-back losses, St. Mary's and Washington State. We'll get into all that. Jack Breslin, who hosts the Santa Clara basketball podcast, will hop on to talk about Santa Clara, not only its matchup against OSU, what they look like coming up, and then, of course, that matchup with St. Mary's on Wednesday. So we'll get into all of that. Huge games this week. Again, mentioned that one that's going to be on Wednesday. Oregon State and Gonzaga take on each other on Tuesday at the Kennel. So that is the return game of the matchup from a few weeks ago, where Oregon State did pull the upset at Gill Coliseum. So big one on that one. I'll preview what that's going to look like in just a bit. The rest of Thursday's slate: Portland at LMU, Pepperdine at San Diego, Washington State at Pacific. And of course, the big one this coming Saturday is Gonzaga at St. Mary's. And this one going to be at UCU Pavilion. So a lot of really good basketball coming up, and we're going to talk about all of that. And of course, there will be the Saturday unofficial WCC live to preview the Saturday matchups. Obviously, like the Gonzaga St. Mary's, but then also another big matchup on that day is going to be Washington State at USF, the rematch on the Hilltop. All right, so we're going to get going, and I'm going to start with St. Mary's and Washington State and what we saw out of this game. The Cougars, after a really lackluster performance at Santa Clara, where they really suffered from turnovers and getting beat up inside the paint, they jumped on St. Mary's early in this game at the Palouse. They led by double digits multiple times. They had a 10-point lead in the second half, but in each occasion, St. Mary's just chipped away, and ended up winning this game 80-75. This was a gutsy, gritty win for St. Mary's. This was definitely not the best defensive performance. This was definitely not the best of what we've seen of St. Mary's, but they did just enough to get the road victory, which any victory on the road is a huge one. And for St. Mary's, speaking of the road, this was their 14th straight road victory, which is the longest streak in all of college basketball. And they have not lost a road game since February of 2023. And this game really was all about, it was gutsy, it was gritty, as I mentioned, but also it was about poise and patience. Despite getting down on multiple occasions and even in certain spots, every St. Mary's run was met by another Washington State burst. It never felt like St. Mary's was out of control, that they never felt like they were out of this game. And it was very clear in the leadership of this squad. It's like the way Augustus Marshallonis led this team down the stretch in that second half. You could just see that they were not panicked by being down on the road, being down by double digits, and they continued to just chip away and kind of do what St. Mary's does, and that's just methodically put together games where they're going to put themselves in a good position to win. They were +6 rebounding. They were +4 on the offensive boards, which honestly both numbers are a little below their season average, but they were still able to. I thought that was almost the difference in this game. It was that when St. Mary's needed a second opportunity late in this ball game, they were able to get it. When they needed a basket late in this ball game, they were able to get it. They shot 57% from the field. Marshallonis was 17 points, 7 assists. Paulus Morauskas, who had a great week, 25 points and 12 rebounds for him. Mitchell Saxon was also in double figures in this one. But I mentioned that this was not your traditional St. Mary's game. Again, you saw that Washington State scored 75 in this game, which is the most of any opponent that St. Mary's has seen to this point in WCC play. They shot 57% from the field, and this is something that Washington State has continually done all year long. It's like even in these tough games, you look at Gonzaga, you look at Santa Clara, you look at St. Mary's, you look at USF, or well, they haven't played Oregon State yet, but you look at some of the in-conference games that they've had, the offense has continued to run. The offense has continued to do what it needs to do. The challenge has been in other areas. The challenge in going into this one, a lot of what I talked about was turnovers. Washington State is one of the worst in all of college basketball when it comes to turning the ball over, and they were a little bit better about it in this game. They only had 12, or they do average more than 15 a game. And they also got St. Mary's kind of off of their game early on, where St. Mary's is a team that only averages about 9.5 turnovers a game. And they had 10, or they had, I think it was double digits by halftime. So there was a very different St. Mary's squad. But even despite all those turnovers, despite all the things that seemed to be going Washington State's way, we went into that half with them, the Cougars, only leading by 3, and it really just felt like this was a matter of time for St. Mary's to retake the lead and crawl back and get this game. And that's kind of what happened. Even though Washington State did have a good early push there in the second half, you just saw St. Mary's methodically get this win, put it together, and really be able to push back enough against this Washington State team that had enough going for it. Ethan Price had 20 points. He was 4 for 7 from 3. Nate Calmeson, Dane Erickstrup, both were in foul trouble at various points, but they both finished with 16. Lawan Watts maybe had a little bit more of he had spurts, but it wasn't like the big breakout games like we saw the other night where he had a triple-double, or even just last week where we saw him have some big performances. This was kind of like it was kind of an average performance from Watts overall. And it's put both of these teams in very different positions. St. Mary's is now 8-0 in WCC play. They have a 2-game lead on everyone in the league. And on the flip side, you have this Washington State team, which now has picked up, this is its 4th loss in WCC play. So now it's starting to fall back toward the middle of the pack, which kind of, thinking about what this team has done to this point, looking at the results, obviously it's like we've seen them not have as great performances as maybe as we thought we saw earlier in the season. The game at Santa Clara got away from them late. The game against Gonzaga got away from them late. The game obviously always going to point to Pacific and what we saw there, how they were unable to close that game. They were unable to close the St. Mary's game. We see some consistent themes of what happens down the stretch and in games for Washington State, and that's something that they're going to continue to have to address. I do think we might be getting to the point where their lack of depth is starting to present itself. And that was something that I think was always going to be a concern when you saw the which injuries were happening and at what time. The fact that you lose Cedric Coward, the fact that you lost Isaiah Watts at key parts of the schedule really impacted what this team is going to be able to accomplish long term. And while they're still not, it's not like that they're getting blown out for the most part. Obviously, they did against Santa Clara, but this is still a team that's competitive. This is still a team that's very much capable of beating really anybody in the conference on any given night because they have the firepower. It's a matter of whether or not that they can kind of withstand some of like the grind that some of these WCC teams are going to put you through later in games as it gets closer and closer to March. Okay, so talked about St. Mary's, and St. Mary's will be taking on Santa Clara on Saturday. So with that, we're going to bring in Jack Breslin to talk about what that matchup is going to look like, what Santa Clara looked like on Saturday against Oregon State, and a bit about what we're going to see from Santa Clara and what his thoughts are of where they are at the moment. All right, happy to bring in Jack Breslin, who hosts the Santa Clara Basketball Podcast. This Santa Clara team had a up and down week. Obviously, big win against Washington State, and then a not so great performance, but maybe an understandable performance against Oregon State up at Gill Coliseum. What's your kind of thought after maybe these last couple of weeks where we've seen kind of the very good and the still things to work on from the Broncos?
Yeah, you just alluded to it. Like this season, there have been games as a Bronco fan that I have lost sleep over. You know, you think about at USF when we, clutched defeat from the jaws of victory, North Dakota State, Stanford, whatever. This is not one of those games. We had no Tyree Bryan, who we're going to talk about in a second. makes a huge impact. Tilly goes out with 4 fouls with 16 minutes left. That's huge. Cam Tongue goes down. The trainer comes out 3 different times for him. It was just kind of a really tough game. And then you have Michael Ratai making some ridiculous, really well guarded threes down the stretch that were just gut punches. But look, we battled back. And when you're a live and die by the 3 team, you're going to have games like this. We were 9 of 27, right? But that's not the percent. Our average is like 35, 36%. And in the last few games, when you're 9 of 27, you've been shooting above 40%. It feels like you can't throw the ball in the ocean. So, look, Oregon State's a really good team. We just said they're 13-1 at home. It's a tough place to play. So you just got to, learn from it and look forward to the next. But like you said, an understandable performance, despite the fact that it was a loss.
Yeah, I mean, like this, we've seen obviously the Santa Clara team be able to win on the road. Obviously, being Gonzaga at Gonzaga is a proof positive that they can win anywhere in any building, any environment. This Oregon State team, and again, like there's almost a lot of similarities between Oregon State and Santa Clara. If you actually think about like the wins that they have are very similar. The resume looks very similar. Outside of maybe, obviously Santa Clara has done more damage in quad 1, quad 2, but they split the season matchup. They both have wins against Gonzaga. They both lost to LMU. They have similar resumes looking at this team. But like now taking a step back and look at where Santa Clara is for conference play. Obviously they're 6-3. They're still kind of hovering right around there. Like I think they're tied for 3rd or something like that. And how are you feeling about this Broncos team, where they are, and also like starting to look at what they have coming up, because they've kind of gone through some of the tougher part of the conference schedule to this point?
Yeah, so the next 5 games, right, looking forward to the 3 weeks, you've got St. Mary's twice, and then you've got Pacific, Portland, and San Diego. So looking at those, I'm not, knock on wood, you'd hope that you get at least 3 wins out of those 3 middle games. And then, look, I'm thinking about an at-large bid. That's been my goal for a long time. And we can lose a maximum of 1 game, I think, going forward for the rest of the season, which is obviously an uphill battle when you play St. Mary's twice and Gonzaga comes to town 1 more time. But look, I feel good. I'm still at the position, I said it on my podcast, where this team is better than we were 2 weeks ago, a month ago. We keep getting better. And if that continues, I'm going to feel really good. So positive despite last night, and hoping we can continue to get better.
Yeah, all right, let's kind of wind back. I kind of did go out of order a little bit here. It's about Oregon State and the Santa Clara matchup. I mean, like this is a game where, yeah, we talked about like how Michael Ratai is just kind of like went blitz, and like we've seen him like go do this against a number of teams. He had 30 last night. Was I think 10 for 10 from the free throw line. Like this is a guy who's going to end up in the conversation for Player of the Year, so we know that. But thinking about like what this Santa Clara team, even just kind of trying to uphill battle, it felt like all night long. Thinking about what is kind of like the impact of not having Tyree Bryan in that lineup, because obviously we saw him against Gonzaga, what he's able to do there, but that's kind of like the outlier for what we normally see from him. And on a night in, night out basis, when he's not present, what does this team start missing?
So the short answer is he makes a huge difference. Offensively, yes, I think everybody's thinking recently about his offense because of what he did in Spokane. He can make open shots. Like right now, as a Bronco fan, when he's open for 3, he's kind of the guy, him and Adama, where if they got an open look, I'm feeling the best. But it's the defense. The defense is what is the biggest difference that he is able to bring. And it's the same word. It's consistency. And I think Michael Ratai last night having 30 is a great example of that. Ty, since he got to Santa Clara, has been our most consistent on-ball defender, right? You put him on, I'll compare it to Lou Dort in the NBA. You put him night in and night out on the other team's best player, and he does a pretty good job, right? Look at the San Francisco game where Malik Thomas came in and he had 13 points when he was averaging 25. He ended up with 19, but it was kind of garbage time down the stretch. But he just does a really good job on the ball. He brings it every night. So I think it's consistency, it's a little bit of leadership, and it's intensity, especially in the defensive end that we miss. So fingers crossed, really hoping we see him on Wednesday night against the Gaels.
Yeah, I agree. Like that is one of the guys that you start to think about, like is a huge difference maker. And again, probably a guy needed to have around for that St. Mary's game on Wednesday. Now talking about St. Mary's, like this is a team that, I mean, Santa Clara has done, I think, fairly well against St. Mary's over the last couple years. Kind of like throw out that that game at the Levy Center a year ago where that was the back-to-back with Gonzaga, and that was just all energy spent on the Zags and just none left for St. Mary's 2 nights later. But the one in Morago was one going to that game. St. Mary's kind of dominated the first half, but Adama Ball kind of led the charge back into that game, made that a single-digit game. That was a really close one down the stretch. When you start to think about what the Broncos need to do, or what kind of the key matchup you're looking at for St. Mary's, what are you watching for in that game on Wednesday?
Yeah, so the first thing from a personnel perspective is that Christoph Tilley and Cam Tung need to stay out of foul trouble. That scares me a little bit, right? Because Cam, for as good as he's been in his limited minutes, he comes in and he's super energetic, plays so hard, right? He has this tendency to put his hands on people and get fouls. And if Tilley also picks up fouls, who's going to guard Mitchell Saxon? Right. So that's kind of my first thing, is that's the biggest risk area, is if we have foul trouble with our bigs, we could be in trouble. The second thing I hope to see, last night, I feel like we weren't great in transition. And I think Oregon State did a great job of getting back. But how do you beat one of the best half-court offenses in the country? You don't let them play half-court offense. You rush the ball down the floor and you try to score when they're not set. So I'd hope to see that. And then the last thing would be rebounding. Santa Clara, we've been really good on the glass throughout conference. We're third right now as far as rebound margin, behind, of course, St. Mary's, who's dominating that category. They're plus 11 on average. Not at best, on average. That's unbelievable.
Like second best in the country, I believe.
Crazy.
Is the number.
So we have to go out, and I think that should be the biggest thing that the coaches circle, is say, we have to win the rebound battle in this game. And if we can do that, keep our guys out of foul trouble, and hopefully get some quick buckets on the break, I think we got a pretty good chance. But if we don't do those three things, I think we could be in for a long night.
I mean, thinking about like that matchup again, like it is one of the games I know, like I definitely getting some messages from St. Mary's folks they're not scared of Santa Clara or whatever else. I'm like, Santa Clara is the one team that actually concerns me the most because of personnel, because of just the number of weapons that this team has. And you mentioned like getting out in the break and everything else. We saw a little bit of Washington State do that last night against St. Mary's and trying to get out and run, because that's more of their game. That's actually kind of why I was thinking even Santa Clara, Washington State last week was very similar styles and what they wanted to do and how they want to run. So that was, seeing Washington State kind of do that against St. Mary's last night was, I think, a little bit of a sign of what we're probably going to see, obviously, on Wednesday with Santa Clara. Thinking, and for that matchup, again, like we talked off air about St. Mary's, and just that this is maybe the team that you're actually looking at as like maybe the one you're scared of most in this conference, almost kind of flip side of Santa Clara is probably the one that concerns me the most on the St. Mary's side.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we said off the air, as a Bronco fan right now, the Gaels scare me more than Gonzaga does, because St. Mary's, on the defensive end especially, their consistency, just 40 minutes a game, they're just going to play so hard. Obviously, they're just so well coached. And so I think another risk area for me would be, we've seen in some of these games, I'll use the first Oregon State game at the Levy Center as a great example. We go up 10 in both halves. We were up 10 in the first half, and then we were up 10 late in the second half. And both times, Oregon State was able to make a run and come back in it. So sometimes we have these lapses in our games, and it's been a little bit of a theme this year where, we can get punched in the mouth by another team. I don't see that from St. Mary's this year. Last year you had these stretches, and there's been a couple times this year, but not as much, where they would just not be able to score for like 8 minutes, right? I don't see that happening. And even if it does happen, they're so good defensively that it's probably not going to hurt them as much. So we have to be able to go out and play well, frankly, for 40 minutes, because if we don't, for the 5 minutes or the 10 minutes that we're not, we're going to get hit.
I really, like, one of the things I think that is one of the greatest challenges against St. Mary's is that when, maybe not necessarily during their scoring drought, it's when St. Mary's puts you into a scoring drought. Because 100%. This is the one thing of like, we've seen St. Mary's do this so well over the years of when they decide you're not going to score anymore, you stop scoring really
Yes.
at all. But it's trying to weather that storm. It's like you have to know that those stretches are coming and know how to try to figure your way out of those situations. And it's almost like it's really having that patience and not trying to speed up, not trying to do too much, because when you try to do that, you almost play right into what St. Mary's wants you to do.
Right. And I'll throw one more thing in there is on our offensive end. Last night we had tendencies, and I've talked about it before, where the ball just kind of sticks, right? A guy catches it and they start looking around or they're just dribbling in place. You can't do that against St. Mary's. You have to move them around. And Washington State would be the best counterexample. I don't think there was a single possession where the ball stuck for more than 3 seconds with a guy. The ball has to move. And that, for me, has been like the biggest variable that most correlates to our success in the offensive end. If that thing is sticking on Wednesday, I think it's going to be a long night. So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean that game on Wednesday, I believe it's 6 p.m., which is a awful time.
I'm on the East Coast. You're telling me.
The awful time to try to get anywhere in the Bay Area at 6 p.m. down at Santa Clara. It's going to be a rough one to commute to, but hopefully there'll be a good crowd down there for that one. I know at least some of the St. Mary's folks I talked to will be making that trip down.
Right.
For Santa Clara, looking at where we are now, 6-3, halfway through league play. Overall, I think you have to be probably feeling pretty good about where this team is, and how good are you feeling about? I mean, it feels like 3-4, the 3-4 seed is almost kind of like that's almost floor at this point.
Yeah.
And there's still the possibility of getting the 2 seed. Just thinking about how are you feeling about the chances of maybe the possibility of not having to play in the WCC tournament until Monday?
I mean, obviously that's the goal. But you're right. Like if you look at our schedule, what we've done, who we've already played and what we have coming up, we have a lot more of the games against your Pacific, Portland, San Diego, coming up in the second half of the schedule of the WCC than what we've already done. So to be 6-3, I mean, to have a win at Gonzaga under your belt already, to have beat Washington State, split with San Francisco. Look, I couldn't, obviously, LMU keeps me up at night, like I said, still, but I would have taken this. If you would have said, back in December, I can offer you 6-3 on January 26th, I would have said, give it to me.
All right. Yeah, this is going to be a fun ride the rest of the way. The Santa Clara squad is still the one that concerns me the most, is the team I keep saying, and I know others might disagree, is the most dangerous team in this league if you're St. Mary's or Gonzaga. And if you're Gonzaga, you definitely know this because you've already picked up an L to the Broncos. Jack, thanks for hopping on, chatting some Santa Clara hoops, and we will definitely catch up later on in the season.
Thanks, Zach. Good to be on.
This Santa Clara team is almost one of the more confusing yet predictable teams in the WCC, because we know about all the talent. We know they've had a lot of big wins, but they also have had moments where they have struggled in various scenarios. Now, I will say the Oregon State game, and I mentioned it obviously earlier in that chat, is that this game, it was almost a lot of the pieces fell into place for them to fail at Oregon State. One, because Oregon State is just very good at home. Number two, the injuries. Tyree Bryan not being available for that game is a big blow, and I do think that that's going to play a factor in what we're going to see on Wednesday against St. Mary's. If Tyree Bryan is available, I think there is a shot for Santa Clara to pull off the upset at the Levy Center, but if he is unavailable, that is going to make it just that much more difficult. It's going to put a lot more pressure, I think, on the likes of Cam Tung. It's going to put more pressure on the front court to really hold down this St. Mary's front line, at the very least on the rebounding front. We know that St. Mary's is one of the best in the entire country in rebounding margin, so making sure that you're at least in the ballpark with them is critically important. And Jack mentioned it, the foul trouble with both Tung and also Christoph Tilley is going to be incredibly important. If they can stay on the floor and continue to be a factor on the offensive end and on the defensive end, it gives Santa Clara much more of a chance, because we saw what happens if Santa Clara gets off the rails even just a little bit against the St. Mary's team. last year we saw it like 2 nights later after a Gonzaga win. Santa Clara just got boat raced by the Gaels, and this is a team that if you give them enough of an opportunity, you really start to show some cracks in your armor. You make some mistakes that it can snowball against a team like St. Mary's, and it's a team that will limit its own mistakes, and it really adds to the pressure of what you're going to have to do. Now, will say this: I think the Carlos Stewart coming back is going to be an interesting factor because that is someone who does remember beating St. Mary's. That is someone who was at Santa Clara the last time that they were able to get a win against the Gaels, and it's someone who adds a different wrinkle. It's someone who adds, like, talk about like strength. Like Carlos Stewart is a load at the point guard position, and there aren't too many guards who might be able to match his physicality or his strength. Augustus Marciulionis might be one of those guys, and I think that's going to be a fascinating matchup on just like the toughness between those two and what that's going to look like. They play very different styles, but the physicality of the two of them, I think, is going to be a fun one to watch. Also, just thinking about the impact of Johnny O'Neal, because Johnny O'Neal, like, it really does feel like if he is on, Santa Clara turns into near unbeatable. And if he is off, that is when they run into problems. We saw that early on in the non-conference when he wasn't playing as well. But now he's playing some of his best basketball of the season. So the Santa Clara St. Mary's game is going to be a lot of fun. This is going to be on the road at the Levy Center. First time these two will be meeting. They will be meeting again in a couple of weeks in Moraga. But this one I think this is going to come down to the rebounding and whether or not Santa Clara can stretch out the St. Mary's defense and start hitting some of those threes, because St. Mary's is one of the best at defending the perimeter. All right, so let's get into the Zags, because going into the week, one of the big thing that everyone was pointing to is the defense. The defense, the defense, the defense. What could Gonzaga do this week to start to turn the page on what has been a very subpar defensive effort the last few weeks? And we saw some immediate changes, which was something I said, like, they have to do. They has to be done immediately, and it was done immediately as we saw 2 starter changes in the lineup for two different reasons. But we saw Emmanuel Innocente entered into the starting lineup for Caleb Battle, and then we also saw Braden Huff enter the starting lineup for Graham Ike, maybe the shocker of the bunch. But this was something that was needed. A shakeup was necessary to, I think, get this team back on track and get them kind of focused on what they needed to do on the defensive end. And sure enough, that at least worked against Portland. They won 105-62, getting that 43-point victory. They held Portland to 34% from the field, outscored them 58-22 in the paint. Emmanuel Innocente with the 23 minutes, 8 points, 5 assists, so good effort from him. Michael Ajayi off the bench, 20 points, 8 rebounds in 20 minutes, so it was a little bit more out of him as well, so better activity from Ajayi. The changes were necessary, and it's always, you can't completely go overboard with the result against Portland. Portland, as we know, they're just not that great of a team. So it's a matter of making sure that the principles that you are taking into that Portland game are able to carry over to Oregon State. And that's what is going to be the big challenge. I think the Innocente change was necessary. I think that's going to be interesting to kind of see how that carries over and what that matchup is going to look like on that end. The Graham Ike one was addressed after the game by Mark Few. That was a little bit more about the technical in the last game. So this was not about Graham Ike versus Braden Huff. This was definitely more of a little bit more disciplinary than anything else. So you should expect him to be back in the starting lineup come Tuesday night. And for this game, this is one that Gonzaga lost just a couple weeks ago. This was one of the 2 straight losses. Oregon State getting that win, 97-89 in overtime. in their building. Michael Rataj had 29, Nate Kings had 20, Graham Ike had 26. He fouled out in overtime. Ben Gregg with 15 and 13. And they're two. Obviously, the Gonzaga defense is a key in this one. This is something that is going to be probably the focus for them over the next few weeks, especially when you think about that they have St. Mary's this Saturday. If they haven't fixed the defensive problems by the time they get to Moraga, they are going to be in big trouble against that team. And it's also about the perimeter defense. I think the insertion of Innocente into the starting lineup is going to help that. Keeping Nate Kings in check is going to be huge for them. Like, Nate Kings, to me, is kind of the X factor for Oregon State. He had 20 in the first matchup. If you can keep him off that three-point line or make it more difficult for him to get those shots off, that is going to put Gonzaga in a much better position. And if this game is kept close, it's also the composure late in games. We have seen Gonzaga fall apart time and time again this season. And if they are in a close one against a team like Oregon State, a team that has the confidence that they have beaten this team already, are they going to be prepared to close this sort of game out? Is Graham Ike going to keep his cool? Is Ryan Nembhard going to be able to make the right play at the right time? Because unfortunately, we've actually seen him make a couple miscues late in some of these contests. Now, the one guy that actually has been really good in these late game situations as of late has been Nolan Hickman. And if he gets going early and he continues his solid play that we've seen over the last few weeks, obviously that's just another positive for the Zags. For Oregon State, one is like the first and foremost, it's keeping Michael Rataj on this heater that he's on. Since that game, the 29 against Gonzaga, the last four, he's averaging nearly 25 points per game. He is looking very much like what could be the WCC Player of the Year at this stage. He had a career high. The 29 he had was a career high at that point. He had a career high 30 the other night against Santa Clara. So he's starting to rev up, and he's starting to get better and better as the season is going along. And so that matchup of Rataj and it's probably going to be Ben Gregg is the one checking him the most often, but that's going to be a fascinating watch and just kind of see if Gonzaga can slow him down this time around, because they were unable to do it in round one. The other thing is keeping Gonzaga off the glass. Oregon State was minus 13 in that game the last time around. They have to protect that paint much better than they did the last go round. They have to be able to limit their second chance opportunities this time around. That also was a struggle for them. So this is another thing for Oregon State to watch and focus on. So Parsifala, Rataj are going to really have to be on their P's and Q's about making sure that they're boxing out well and keeping guys off the glass. Keep getting to the free throw line. This is one of the better teams at getting to the free throw line. They had more than 30 free throw attempts against Gonzaga. Obviously, that might be a bit high to get at the kennel, but I do think that this is something that we have seen time and time again that Oregon State has been able to do against teams, and doing that again is going to be important, not only just slowing the game down and playing it at their pace, but also that could potentially put guys like Ike, Huff, and others in foul trouble, and which will help them open up that offense even more. And DeMarco Minor controlling the pace of this game. We talked about what Gonzaga needs to do, composure late in their games. It's the same for Oregon State. And DeMarco Minor, I think, has done a pretty good job of that late in some of these close contests. And what he's able to do and keeping Oregon State going on offense is going to be critical late in a game like this. Oregon State and Gonzaga, this is going to be really interesting. The other interesting part is just the home versus road contrast between these two. Gonzaga is 9-1 at home, the one loss being the Santa Clara game. Oregon State is 1-4 on the road. Lost at Santa Clara, lost at LMU, lost at USF, lost at North Texas. They have yet to get kind of like that big road win. The one road win is Pacific right now. And They need to show that they can take their act on the road and continue to play well away from Gill Coliseum. And they haven't been able to get over that hump. I mentioned like some of those games. I mean, they only lost to Santa Clara by 1. They only lost to North Texas by 3. Now, the other two by 11, by 21, those inexcusable outings in the way they played those games. But Oregon State needs to prove that they can still get over the hump on the road. And right now, they're still in sort of position to do damage on the at-large front. They're in the 50s in the net. But they still haven't really proven that they can get these quad 1, quad 2 victories, and especially on the road. A road victory here, not only do you sweep Gonzaga, which would be maybe the biggest shocker of them all because of how rare that is, but also solidifying that this is a team that can play its best away from home, play on the road. And this is something that the Beavers still need to prove, and it's the perfect opportunity to do it against maybe the toughest place to play in the WCC. All right, so thinking about that game, there's a lot. Obviously, the other games this week are going to be interesting. I do think, looking at Washington State Pacific, the rematch there is going to be something to watch. But also, it's keeping an eye on LMU right now. They have now won 3 straight. They're 4-4 in WCC play. They have Portland and San Diego this week, so they have a chance to get above 500 for the first time in WCC play this season. And if you look at the rest of their schedule, they have an opportunity to, I think, climb some of these standings. Now, keep in mind that LMU only plays Oregon State and Washington State once, and they are done with both of them. They've already played Gonzaga once. They've already played St. Mary's once. The rest of their schedule gets much more favorable. Portland, San Diego this week. Then they do get Gonzaga at Gonzaga, but then they get USF at Gersten Pavilion, and they have defended the home court well to this point. They still have to play Pepperdine, Pacific, Portland, Pepperdine before league play is over. And you could realistically make the case on their schedule that they could maybe finish about 10-8 in league play, which will put them probably about the 5 or the 6 seed going into the WCC tournament. Like, they're actually, because of the matchups that they have left, because of what they've already done, honestly, the Oregon State and Santa Clara games are doing a lot of heavy lifting here as they split with the Pac-12 teams. They already have that win against Santa Clara. They still have to get Santa Clara again on the road, but they still have USF coming to their building, still have St. Mary's coming to their building, and still get a lot of the lower half of the league on their calendar. They're playing well right now. They're beating the teams they should beat. And for a team that has been squarely in the middle of the WCC all season long, this is maybe they're sneakily climbing back up the ladder. They're sneakily hovering right there. And if teams are not careful, if there's a squad that's going to sneak up on somebody because we're all paying attention to Gonzaga, St. Mary's, Santa Clara, USF, Oregon State, Washington State, LMU's right there hovering behind them all, and they could very easily catch one of these teams that are starting to slide further and further down. All right, well, that'll do it for this episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Be sure to hit the subscribe button, like on social media, at Post by Zag, at unofficial WCC pod. We will be doing a Saturday morning live to preview the Saturday matchups and also recap what we saw over the course of the early part of the week. Saturday, we have Washington State at USF, and then it's Gonzaga at St. Mary's, 8 p.m. on ESPN that night. So a lot to get into that day. We'll be scheduling an interview with somebody, so keep an eye out for that. Probably the link for that and everything will be coming out on Friday. All right, thanks for watching, everybody, and I will catch you later.